Thank you very much. And I want to first thank the Dragon Star Plus project to have invited me here today to share the insights that we have generated in a project that we run over the last 2 years with you about manufacturing in Europe and how we did it using a foresight approach. So first of all, very quickly, who we are. So we are the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. We are a body with about 2,200 scientists, which is essentially the science arm of the European Commission, providing scientific evidence for EU policy making. More specifically, I'm in a unit called the EU Policy Lab, where we use foresight, we use behavioral sciences, and we use design for policy to actually try and find innovative ways to serve European policy making. So what we do, very shortly, we explore issues, we experiment in innovative policy-making processes, we connect people, we design participatory processes, and we find solutions for better EU policy-making. We work primarily, of course, for the European Union and to serve European Union policies, but we work with a lot of people, and essentially with everybody, and as will be illustrated by what I'm going to present to you now. So we had this project that we called Future of Industry project, which was requested to us by the Director General in charge of the internal market and industry of the European Commission. And the aim of the project was to propose actions to address the barriers, to seize opportunities, and to develop technologies to ensure the long-term success of manufacturing in the European Union. And the scope of this was, of course, European manufacturing industry, but in a very global dimension, recognizing the connection of Europe with the rest of the world. So the approach that we developed is foresight-based. It's really very much bottom-up, it's inclusive, and it's serving an existing policy objective. And essentially, as exemplified in some of the Commission communications on the future of manufacturing, to bring the share of manufacturing in EU GDP to 20% of EU GDP by 2020. So this was not an exercise in building an industrial strategy, this was really an exercise in how to find the best ways to serve the existing policy objective. The methodology that we applied was based on a tool that we called the Industrial Landscape Vision 2025, which is very future-oriented, which is inclusive of all the stakeholders relevant for the future of manufacturing in Europe, and it's a very much qualitative approach. The requirements that were given to us by the Director General Laurent was to generate practical insights for decision-making in EU policy, to be applicable across industry sectors, and of course to be transferable to other people to actually run this approach and perform this project. I'm not going to spend time explaining this slide, it's just to give you an overview of the model that we used to run this project, which is called the Industrial Landscape Vision. Essentially, it's a tool that was developed in a previous foresight study, where we have the blue part at the core, which is the model of how an industry sector or manufacturing sector is operating with the basic functions. And all around, you have all the factors influencing its evolution on the long term. So how we did this, we had a 5-step process where we started by understanding what we call the agents of change. So all the external factors that are influencing the way the manufacturing industry is evolving. Then we went back into understanding the core, the blue center of the previous slide that I showed you, understanding how the system works and how the agents of change are influencing the different elements of the manufacturing system. Then we generated a vision, including all the people participating in our workshop, coming from industry, but also from the research area, policy making, customers, students, very wide range of people. Then we explored the specific challenges that were identified during the conversations we had with all these people. Finally, to identify who should do what to ensure a successful long-term life for manufacturing in the European Union. So this method is described and it's available. We've run it a couple of times, we validated it, and now it's available to everybody who wants to use it. Visioning in practice. So just to have an illustration of the type of work that we did, just to show you, that we worked with a fairly large group of people, about 35 experts from different areas. And then we worked with a very much participatory approach where we populated, the poster I showed you before with the specific elements for the specific sectors that we analyzed. So we run this process on 2 specific sectors. One is the textiles and clothing sector, and the other one is the non-ferrous metal sector. These 2 studies are ready and available. I've brought a few copies of the reports of the studies, which are available on the table here at the corner of the room or on the registration table if people are interested. So, very quickly into the details, so I don't have much time here to go really very much into all the details and all the findings that we got from these studies. But very quickly, the first stage, which was the visioning stage for both sectors, gave a few interesting aspects. So, first of all, the non-ferrous metal industry, said they wanted to be a trusted world leader, developing sustainable, innovative, and competitive solutions. And the textiles and clothing also said they wanted to be making innovative and competitive products. A very much solutions-oriented vision for themselves. Very much focus also on making an effort to close material loops. There is this very strong concept, going on in Europe right now of the circular economy. So people are really trying to become material efficient. Then there is also the evolving customer and societal needs. So industry recognizes the need to actually serve society, and that's very strong in their long-term vision. Also emphasizing the need to collaborate across sectors and among the different stakeholders of the value chain. Also attracting skilled and talented entrepreneurs and employees on both sides, recognition of the needs to both maintain the existing skills that they have in their traditional sectors, but also acquiring the new skills needed to get into this digital world that you were describing to us earlier in the various presentations. And then we've got a few differences, environmental and ethical standards, shifting to renewable energy sources on the non-ferrous metals parts, because this is a very energy-intensive sector. This is something which is less apparent in the textile sector. And then, of course, engaging in the cross-sectoral collaboration is something which is important for everybody. So these are the core visions that both sectors developed before we started to generate recommendations. Now, in this work, what we saw is that specific sets of challenges emerged, which were really very, very clear. Even though the original focus of the request that we got from DG Grow was really on the manufacturing industry and advanced manufacturing technologies, the challenges that were identified by both sectors were one of innovation, one of access to resources and resource efficiency, one of trade, that was very, very strong in both sectors, and one of skills. And both sectors came up with these 4 challenges independently. So they seem to be underlying concerns that the manufacturing industry seems to have across the board. It would be really interesting to see whether, if we were using this approach on other sectors, the same type of concerns and challenges, perceived challenges would emerge. So again, I don't have very much time here. I'm not going to go through everything that we found in this study. I've taken trade, the trade challenge as one example, just to see, in parallel what the 2 sectors came up with. And a strong point that came out on both sides, in spite of all the differences, is the wish to both operate according to very high standards. And when we talk about standards, we don't mean only technical standards for high quality products, but also ethical standards, environmental standards, and social standards. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is not only operating according to these very high standards, but also developing new standards that can then be shared across the globe so that everybody in all the industry sectors across the globe can operate to the highest level of standards to ensure a sustainable world in the long term. Another strong point of commonality between the two sectors is a very strong consumer or customer focus, which people recognize. You know, we were seeing the example of the Adidas factory earlier in one of the presentations. You know, this idea that you are now able, thanks to all this digital technology, to really tailor your product to the most intimate consumer needs. So that's really a recognized trend on both sides. Now, in terms of proposed policy actions, you see very much a complementarity between what actions people want to take on the industry side to what they would like the policy side to take. So, a harmonization of standards. And that came very, very strongly in the textile discussions, for example, especially between the EU and the US, where people felt that differences of standards were creating barriers to smooth and fair global trade. The enforcement of the high standards I was talking about before. Now, very quickly, in terms of the key policy actions that were suggested across the board, from the policymakers, there was a demand for showing leadership and for developing predictable and consistent policies, you know, that are aligned with the visions. You know, the visions were very much inspired by a desire to become more sustainable on the long term, to close material loops, to serve consumers better, these kind of things. And so people wanted to have a coherence between the policy and the visions. Building a good investment environment, investing in infrastructure, using public procurement, funding research and development, supporting innovation, so more financial instruments. Very, very strong messages to build a global level playing field. So to be able to enable better players, industry players, to operate at global level, to serve, you know, global consumers in the best possible ways. And then, of course, having the chance to competing fairly across open markets. So that was very much with a long-term focus. On the industry side, a strong focus was on trying to control materials in order to be able to actually get a chance of closing the material loops and enforcing or developing this circular economy that people are calling for. And so that was really very much connected to some technology needs, both in textile and in the non-ferrous metals, to try and actually use new business models to keep ownership of materials, for example, to be able to recycle them more efficiently, to be able to recognize more easily the specifications of different materials in order to really optimize the opportunity to recycle and close material loops. And that's, of course, connected to data needs and connected to the knowledge that people need to have on materials that they have to recycle, for which they have to close the loops, and also for recycling. Very strong, also, desire to shift towards renewable sources of energy. Energy is a very big concern, you know, in the two European sectors that we've dealt with. Strong need to invest in energy efficiency. Also, in order to optimize the manufacturing system overall and to really be able to close the material loops, building long-term relationship with suppliers, because that allows also to better harmonize standards, better harmonize, you know, the materials and the products going down the value chain. And I think last but not least, a very strong desire to improve the perception of the different sectors among the younger generation, to be able to attract bright minds, because these were both old traditional sectors, and they were saying that they were having difficulties recruiting people because their image, let's say, in the young generation is not very attractive. And then the skills side, so both, I was mentioning that previously, both preserving the traditional know-how about the knowledge of the products that they have, but also acquiring the new skills that they need to really enter in this digital age that the Industry 4.0 is announcing. And so here, the focus are more on materials, energy, and know-how. Finally, very quickly, in terms of the technology needs identified, these were not perceived really as challenges, but technology was perceived very much as a need. You know, it's something that is supposed to be supplied to them to provide solutions, not perceived as a challenge in itself. And so technology to provide traceability of materials, to provide recycling capacities, and a lot of technology needs more oriented towards sustainability objectives, resource efficiency, clean chemistry, renewable energy, environmental impact assessment techniques, and stuff like that. So, reaching my conclusions very quickly, what we saw in terms of these two very different sectors is that we found many common elements which are crossing both sectors. Very, very strong similarities between the long-term visions, even though the timescale of both visions were quite different. The non-ferrous metals industry took a much longer time horizon, for example, because they are a very capital-intensive sector where investment cycles are very long. So for them, 25, 30 years is a normal operational cycle, let's say, for their investment horizons. Interesting to see that they found these shared challenges, you know, among innovation, resources, trade, and skills. As I was saying, technology perceived really as a need, something that has to be developed to serve, you know, needs and to provide solutions. Very strong focus on both sides on quality of products and on standards, even though types of products are very, very different. Digitization is perceived very, very differently. In the non-ferrous metal sectors, it was much more focused on keeping the tab on material and loops of material and process control, while on the textile side, the digital technologies were perceived as much more as something very useful to understand the consumer better and to serve the consumer better and become more flexible in terms of manufacturing. Strategically, both sectors expected very similar things from the policymakers, and I think we only had the opportunity to apply this tool to two different sectors. It would be very interesting to be able to run that on more sectors, to be able to have a broader vision, to see whether some of these messages can be shared more broadly across different types of manufacturing. Conclusion on the method. Actually, we found that this method ran very, very smoothly on both sides. It took a long-term perspective. We really forced participants to really think about long-term, 10 years, 20 years, even more. And also a systemic perspective. So this model that we use really forces people to look at their sector in a 360-degree way. And we even had participants, I remember one from the textile sector who said, I have been very active in this sector for 20 years, and I had never realized that my sector was so diverse. Because people tend to be focused very much in their own line of business in a very, very narrow way. And sometimes it's useful to pull them out and look at the situation in a broader perspective. Inclusive process, so as I was mentioning, not only did we have participation from the sectors themselves, of course, there was very heavy participation from practitioners, but they were mixed with people from academia, from policy making at different levels, from trade unions, even as students. And the way we engaged with the people created a consensus approach on a long-term vision and a sort of collective understanding, collective intelligence of the system that we're looking at that helped conversations on the long term. And finally, it actually allowed us to prepare a set of concrete practical recommendations to DG Grow, which was used both by our policy-making colleagues in their policy-making discussions, but also we discovered that the sectors themselves use the visions actually to communicate with their own members. So at European level, it was interesting to see that it was a sort of win-win situation where also the sector who participated in our process actually used that to get the discussions going with their members, to make them all evolve, let's say, in the same direction, and try to put everybody on board to evolve towards a common sector vision towards the future. And then what we've done was applied to two very contrasted sectors, very, very different natures, and we saw that this method is quite robust and seems to be applicable across a very wide range of manufacturing industries. And it is available to anybody who would like to use it. So, you know, you can contact us and we can explain to you how to run the show. Just very quickly to conclude, it was interesting to see that after our study, you know, in September, President Juncker made a talk on the State of the Union, and he started to mention topics which were coming out strongly in the visions generated by the sectors themselves. So there is a very, very strong alignment, let's say, between the bottom, the companies on the ground, and the top level policy making, which is placing, you know, innovation, digitization, and the decarbonization of the economy at the center of EU's trade war. Thank you very much. I don't want to hold you any longer before lunch, and so I'm going to thank the organizers again. Thank you.
Thank you.